Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 25th of September 2023. I am going to spend a lot of time, comparatively speaking, analysing using some threads from the ISW, less map work today. There are some movements on the map, not a great deal. I've added some trench lines into the Robotyne area only, but it just gives you a greater indication of what's going on. It means I don't have to flip between different maps like Perpetua's map and my own. Before we start, I'm going to go to what the ISW says just as a general analysis. And I think they've had some really interesting things to say in their last 24 hours, both on the socials, but that's drawing from their own reporting in their daily report from yesterday. Anyway, this particular thread, and I shared one with you earlier, which I won't share again, but it's in my news video, talking about the breakthrough down in Verbove. Or whether it is a breakthrough or not is up for debate. The Russian military command may be ordering these counterattacks to buy time. So this is talking about the nature of the Russian defense in counterattacking, and something I've been speaking about, and so it's really nice to see them verify or confirm what I've been claiming, which is that it's this nonsensical approach to the Russians, where you can understand it to certain degrees, but what they keep doing, and they've done this all along the southern front, and they're doing it up in Donetsk at Bakhmut, which is the Ukrainians take some land from the Russians. So let's take Klishchivka as an example. The Ukrainians take Klishchivka back, but all the time they're pushing the Russians back. The Russians are counterattacking. They're not. So, for example, they fought their way through this town, which is down lower than the ground to the west of it. So the Ukrainians had this height advantage. There seemed to be no discernible reason why the Russians would want to stay in Klishchivka and fight to keep it, because it's just it doesn't have any intrinsic value. The value is in the fact that it's a buffer zone, so you don't attack the next place. But you can say that about literally anywhere. It's just like, we might as well fight here, so you don't have to fight there, and then you go back to there, and then you might as well fit, so on and so forth. But here, in this area, we have the railway line, which is an embankment with tree lines both sides of it, and it has dugouts and tunnels in the railway line. So this is a decent defensive line. But instead of just going back to that defensive line and defending from there, and then maybe hitting Ukraine with artillery and supporting their troops in that way, the Russians were counterattacking at every conceivable moment. And indeed, apparently, they still are counterattacking. So Klishchivka has been lost, or at least liberated, by the Ukrainians, and the Russians are still fighting to counterattack. Now, on the one hand, this slows down the Ukrainian advance quite a lot. And this has been the tactic that probably has led to many people saying that the Ukrainians are making much slower progress than was expected. Now, that's a lot to do with the trench lines and a lot to do with the minefields, of course. But it's also to do with, I think, the Russians counterattacking and harassing the Ukrainians at every conceivable moment. And so, therefore, you might look at that and go, well, this is good tactics by the Russians. They are stopping the Ukrainians having quick gain and, continued momentum and having that initiative. But on the other hand, it massively attrits the Russian defenders, so that this costs them. If you're counter-attacking like that, you are throwing your bodies on the line and you're sending them into the Ukrainians. And you will attrit your forces more than the Ukrainians in those situations, I would argue. Rather than if you sat back in your defensive positions, in dugouts and in trenches, and wait for the Ukrainians to attack you and get them to attrit themselves on you. That would be a classic kind of defensive move. And there's been talk about this as a difference between Gerasimov and Surovikin. So Surovikin started building trench lines, saying, right, we're going to pull out of Kherson, we're going to go into a defensive mode, and this will work to our advantage. Whereas Gerasimov was like, no, we're going to defend by attacking. And both of them have their merits to a degree. But if you employ that defend by attacking just all the time, then you are just going to destroy your own capabilities. And the capacity that you have as an armed force. So anyway, that's the context within which this thread is written. But it's unclear how the Kremlin intends to use time bought at such a price. So they are buying time with these counterattacks. What are they going to do with that time? And is it worth the high price anyway, no matter what they do with it, of those counterattacks? And it refers back to another thread here, but I won't go into that thread. Well, actually, I think this might be in the thread I shared with you earlier, which is Russian forces continue to expend a significant combat power on counterattacking to hold their current positions and appear to be resisting the operationally sound course of action of falling back to prepared defensive positions further south. So I will go through this and go back to the original thread. Although it keeps referring to other threads. The Russian command constructed a multi-echelon defense in southern Ukraine that would have allowed the Russian command to deploy defending Russian forces in depth throughout subsequent defensive layers. You defend to the first line, and then when the Ukrainians overcome that, you move to the second line, and if they overcome that, you go to the third line. But you are moving back. You're not attriting your own forces to the point where, when you are retreating, you have very few to man the second line, and then even fewer to man the third line. You are being fine with retreating. Say, look, territory is not the important point here. It's about keeping our forces intact and attriting the opposition, so that their forces, what they want is for the opposition, i.e. Ukrainians, to culminate, to run out, to be exhausted, because they've exhausted themselves moving through those defensive lines. But if you keep taking it to the Ukrainians, that's going to work against you. The Russian command constructed this multi-echelon defensive line, but have instead expended considerable amounts of manpower, material, and effort to hold the forwardmost defensive positions in southern Ukraine. So they're not bothered about second and third lines. They keep the first, attack. And have only withdrawn to subsequent defensive positions at the direct threat of Ukrainian advances. Russian forces' elastic defense requires one echelon of Russian forces slows a Ukrainian tactical advance, while a second echelon of forces counterattacks to roll back the advance. Counterattacking requires significant morale and relatively high combat capabilities. So it's easier. So they say that it's easier to defend. So you've got mobilized, untrained or poorly trained and equipped soldiers, you want to have them in defensive positions. If you're going to do attacking maneuvers, it requires more complexity, higher training, and better equipment, and that doesn't play to the Russians at all. Counterattacking requires significant morale and relatively high combat capabilities, and the Russian military appears to rely on relatively elite units and formations to counterattack, so they're treating their VDV and Marines, likely at the expense of these forces' degradation. American military analysts Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee recently assessed the Russian forces have underutilized the depth of their defenses and have yet to execute a true defense in depth, in which Russian forces trade space for attrition, and I actually went through some of that with you. Kaufman and Lee also assessed that the Russian command's decision to defend forward has allowed Ukrainian artillery units to attrit Russian forces. ISW has observed a concerted Ukrainian effort to attrit Russian forces, even as Ukrainian forces make significant tactical gains, and the Russian resistance to withdrawing to defensive positions further south is likely compounding the asymmetric attrition gradient. In other words, the Ukrainians are not losing as many troops as Russians. Yes, they are losing some troops, probably quite a lot of troops, but the Russians are losing an awful lot more, and they might be slowing the Ukrainians down, but at some point there might be a catastrophic collapse of the Russian forces as they expend all their resources in doing this defending by attacking. To continue, Russian counterattacks aimed at holding forward positions have been tactically significant, but it remains unclear if these counterattacks will have lasting operational importance. That's the point. It might look good now, but actually, in a month's time, the Russians could just suddenly capitulate. So then going back to the original ISW thread, the Russian forces appear to be unwilling to surrender tactical areas and are focusing instead on fighting for every meter instead of benefiting from the depth of their prepared defenses. The Russian sacrifice of combat power to hold every meter may alternatively be intended to support the Kremlin's informational and hybrid warfare objectives. So are they doing this not only because they think it's a sound tactic to use and a sound strategy to use across an operational area, or operational tactic, whatever, but perhaps it's fulfilling criteria that isn't to do with that battlefield at all, but it's to do with the information they're portraying to the world, to their domestic audience. So, hey, look, we haven't lost that much land. Hey, we're defending really well against the best of the Ukrainians. These are the best Ukrainian forces with Leopard 2s and Challengers and Marders and CV90s and Bradleys. And look, they have only advanced this far in this amount of time. Then, yeah, no one's worrying too much about this war. But then at some point, it all falls apart, arguably. Russian President Vladimir Putin first acknowledged the start of the Ukrainian counteroffensive on June the 9th by emphasizing two key persistent narratives. The Ukrainian forces will not achieve significant successes, and that the Ukrainian forces are suffering heavy losses. But if those are his metrics, then the Russians are succeeding. But if one of your metrics is not losing much of your own force, right, this is one of the metrics for Ukrainian success I've talked about previously. Now, if he's not factoring that in as a success criteria, then hey, the Russians are succeeding. But time will tell whether actually this is ultimately not going to be a successful way of defending. So, Putin and the Kremlin have been framing Russian defensive operations as a major battlefield victory, and persistent Russian counterattacks allow the Kremlin to claim these operations as individual victories amidst the general lack of Russian battlefield advances elsewhere. Putin may have ordered the Russian military command to hold all Russia's initial defensive positions to create the illusion that Ukrainian counteroffensive have not achieved any tactical or operational effects despite substantial Western support. This informational undertaking can only succeed in the long run if Russian forces can actually prevent Ukrainian forces from breaking through and liberating large areas. However, the Russian resistance to ceding ground may also be tied to Russian military commanders and officials' attempts to use a counteroffensive to achieve political goals, or it could result from Putin's micromanagement. I think this is really rich stuff coming from the ISW. Some great analysis over the last couple of days in terms of that. And hopefully you would agree. And that's why I spent a long time dealing with that. Let's go now to the front line to look at what the claims are. We're going to start again with the ISW with their daily report of the different areas. So Yevlash, Ukrainian spokesperson, this is going up to the northeastern sector of the front line, which is Kupiansk to Svatove to Crimea, and I haven't given you what my map means or the lines on my map mean, so please pause the video if you want to know what the lines on my map mean. Anyway, we're going to this northeastern sector there, and they say Yevlash, the spokesperson from Ukraine, stated that Russian forces continue to transfer reserves to the Kupiansk and Liman directions, and noted that the Russian attack near Bilohorivka was the first Russian attack in these directions in a long time. So this is to signify that there's been a Russian attack near Bilohorivka. Now, there are two Bilohorivkas, and I'm not sure that they mean this northern one. There has been activity there. There's always activity there. But there's also been activity down near this Bilohorivka as well. And it could well be that he's referring to. I'm not 100% sure. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces achieved unspecified tactical success near Petropavlivka and Sinkivka. So this is going right back up to the north. A Russian news aggregator claimed 2 days ago that Russian forces are gradually taking control of Ukrainian positions near Sinkivka and Petropavlivka and recaptured a number of Ukrainian positions near Novoharivka. Okay, so let's go back to the north. So Petropavlivka and Sinkivka are right up here in the Kupiansk area. So we have Kupiansk here, some advances towards there. There's Sinkivka, there's Petropavlivka. Advances by the Russians in that area, according to the Russians, but they often make these claims and it doesn't seem to come to fruition. Andrew Perpetua's defensive line to the Russians is way back from Syriac maps, and Syriac maps generally toe the party line as far as what the Russian MOD say and claim. And then there are claims that the Russians have made some gains back around Novoharivka, which is here just by Svatove to the west-southwest of Svatove. That may or may not be happening. There are claims as well that Novoselivska, the small village by Kuzumivka, just to remind you, that's to the northwest of Svatove. Just to remind you of what's going on here, the Russians took basically all of Novoselivska after there's been a bit of to and fro there for an awful long time. And then it appears that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back. And now there's footage coming out. I won't show you because I'll get hammered. But Russians retreated in Luhansk. The 32nd Brigade forced the occupiers' unit to retreat in panic and left its positions in the area of the village of Novoselivska, Luhansk, despite threats from its commanders. Don't know what that signifies overall, but it could be that the Ukrainians, there was some rumours I heard last night that the Russians have been pushed completely out of Novoselivska and back into Kuzumivka area, but they do have trench lines between these two rows of houses. They've got trench lines and dugouts in this tree line there and in this tree line here, which means that actually advancing to the east towards Kuzumivka is a challenge for the Ukrainians. But it could be that they're having some success there compared to previous weeks. Right. Anyway, as we come further down south to Bakhmut, we'll go back to the ISW and see what they have to say about Bakhmut. A Russian news aggregator claimed that Russian forces continue to attack Bakhmut's northern flank on September the 23rd, so that's 2 days ago, to push Ukrainian forces from heights near Orikhovo-Vasilivka and Bakivka. Russian sources also claim that Russian forces counterattacked near Kupiansk and Andriivka. Okay, so there's the counterattack idea that we've just been hearing about. So they've lost Kupiansk, they've lost Andriivka, the Russians. They are under pressure in Kupiansk. They've lost some outskirts territory there, and Hero claims that they are counterattacking in both of these places, and probably Klishchiivka too, though they're not definitely. They were counterattacking there quite strongly. Now, going to the north, 2 days ago, there were claims, as according to the ISW, that the Russians have made gains near Orikhovo-Vasilivka, and yesterday I showed you deep state map showing a gain made here. And then today, Deep State Map has reversed that claim exactly, like every millimeter of that claim. It's just like, it looked like either we've got that wrong, or the Russians attacked, took some land, and then the Ukrainians attacked and took every millimeter of land back that they lost in exactly the same way that they lost it. So I don't know what's happened, but it might be a rejig, and it might be that the Russians never did take that. But we have the claims that they've had some success in this northern area by the highway as it comes into the north of Bakhmut. But it seems that those, according to at least the Deep State Map, nothing from any of the other mappers, but Deep State Map pro-Ukrainian mapper, take it with a pinch of salt, they are saying that the Russians have lost that ground that they initially took, or they never took it. Right, coming on down further to the south, we're going to pass Avdiivka, where usual kind of activities are taking place. Not so much great news out of there, as in no real territorial movement. We come down to Vuhledar, where apparently the Russians attacked in near a place called, or in Mikilska, where we have seen them be pushed back from these dachas on the outskirts of Vuhledar, which sits on the heights above Pavlivka and Mikilska. The Russians have been pushed back to Mikilska, and according to the ISW, there have been some attacks by the Russians there attacking near Mikilska. Just going to read you, sorry, I did have this to do with Bakhmut that I think is probably worth reading. A Ukrainian serviceman stated that Russian troops concentrated reserves and artillery systems in the Bakhmut direction to stop Ukrainian advances in the area. Okay, you'd expect that. Reserves, artillery, of course. The serviceman stated that Russian forces have more manpower and artillery systems in the Bakhmut direction than Ukrainian forces, and noted that Russian counterattacks are hard to repel. So we have heard that there is an artillery advantage for the Ukrainians, possibly all along this southern front line. They've done a lot of attrition of the Russian artillery here, I think particularly here, and possibly they have an advantage around the Dnipro River. The Russians are, and we'll look at this later, are using massive amounts of aviation to bomb the heck out of some of these settlements. But there are claims that their counter-battery fire isn't very good. That's coming from the Russians themselves. So I think the Ukrainians have attrited Russian artillery along this line and along the south. But actually in Bakhmut area, there are the claims that the Russians still have considerable artillery there and have had, for since they've been there. And that hasn't changed too much. Now, the Ukrainians have more artillery than maybe they did 6 months ago, but it's still a challenge for the Ukrainians in that area. So this reported relatively high concentration of Russian manpower and equipment in the Bakhmut area suggests the Ukrainians' counter-offensive operations are continuing to draw and fix a significant contingent of Russian forces in the Bakhmut direction, which is their stated purpose. So this is a really interesting conclusion, because actually it's saying that there is significant manpower and artillery for the Russians here is not actually something to go, oh, damn, the Russians are doing well. It's actually that is a success of the Ukrainians working there. So that artillery and those troops are fixed there, which is exactly what we're talking about for a long time with regard to the success of Bakhmut. The success of Bakhmut has been attrition of Russian forces, fixing Russian forces. There you go. They are certainly fixing them, and we're hearing that attrition is bad as well. And those artillery pieces and those troops are not then down here in the south, where they are suffering in terms of counter-battery fire, and Russian artillery is thin on the ground and getting thinner with the huge attritional losses they are taking in that category on a daily basis. So it's an interesting observation there, using the words of a Ukrainian commander. Right. Anyway, going back to where I was, which is going down to Vuhledar. There is still no news coming out from Velika Novosilka. And I told you again this morning that, yes, I said yesterday as well, that the Russians are claiming that 10,000 troops from both there and the Kupiansk and Svatove area have been drafted into Robotyne, and the Russians themselves are claiming it's quiet there. That there's no shelling, there's nothing going on. So I really think it's all about Robotyne. But there are also claims that there are troops that have been moved from there down to Kherson, and that there is a growing force concentration of the Ukrainians there, and that could be really significant, because we might see, if they are able to somehow breach the river and get across it, then we might see this a sort of pincer attack that would cause the Russians a lot of bother, because they've redeployed their own troops from this river area to Zaporizhia. So Zaporizhia is where it's at. It's the absolute desperate fight there between the best of the Ukrainian, the best of the Russians, and the heaviest defenses. But they are thin on the ground along the Dnipro. The challenge is getting heavy equipment across that river. If that can be managed, then this would be a really clever place, I think, for the Ukrainians to attack, because it's not too far from northern Crimea, from Army ants cutting off supplies by road up to Zaporizhia, and they could catch the Russians off guard there. So I think that's really significant. Right, now let's finally go to Robotyne area, where, as you can see from my map now, hopefully I have some, not many, but I have some trench lines added there, just to give you an idea of what's going on in that particular area. I haven't taken them elsewhere because they take quite a long time to do, but anyway, and there are so many of them, but it just gives you an idea of what's taking place there. I'm going to leave them up. Let's go back to the ISW that talks about this area explicitly. So Russian forces continue to expend significant combat power on counter-attacking to hold their current positions, and appear to be resisting the operationally sound course of action and falling back to prepare defensive positions further south, as I've talked about before, as the ISW talked about before. The Russian command constructed a multi-echelon defense. This is the same one I read earlier. Well done, me. Yes, so this is what they're talking about. They've expended, so I don't need to go through this one. I accidentally went through it earlier, but I had it penned for going through now. So as you can see, this multi-echelon defense is essentially redundant at the moment. So this second line of it depends what you define as a first line. I would argue that this was a first line of defense, this was a second line of defense, and you got a third line, and then a fourth line further back from there, in certain areas. But they fought hard to keep the Ukrainians from coming through this line here, but it wasn't a complete line. It kind of started further to the east of Robotyne. The Ukrainians got through that. They were counterattacking, made it really difficult for the Ukrainians to get through that, along with all the mines. They reached the tank ditch, and then eventually got through that, and eventually have got through to the man defenses. But all the while, the Russians are counterattacking and making it hard for the Ukrainians to advance quickly. The question is that worthwhile? So this was the thread from George Barris, who is ISW as well, talking more explicitly about Verbove. So sorry, this is the one I was meant to do. Russian sources report that Ukrainian forces entered Verbove on September the 22nd and continued attacking the settlement with armored vehicles as of the 24th. Russian sources also indicate the Ukrainian forces are operating north of Verbove. So this is one I actually did read to you this morning, but hey, let's do it again. A Russian Airborne Forces VDV affiliated source reported that Ukrainian forces entered Verbove for the first time on the 22nd and continued pushing east. The VDV source later reported that Ukrainian forces occupy half of Verbove as of September the 24th. You know, there might be a slightly different one. So this is significant, right? If this is true, I mean, look at how big Verbove is, or where it sits on the map. If they control half of it, there were some early reports. Remember when they had breached here, and there were reports of some DRG, deep reconnaissance groups of Ukrainians all the way back here. Never quite found out whether that was true, or whether there were talks about Verbove falling really quickly, and it didn't. And that's often the case when Ukrainians make a good advance somewhere. Is people get ahead of themselves, and then lots of kind of false information or half truths come out. But some VDV sources are saying that Ukrainians control half of the settlement. The VDV source accused the Russian MOD of trying to conceal Ukraine's tactical progress in Verbove, rhetorically stating, "For how long can Shoigu's MOD hide the breakthrough in Verbove?" Several Russian sources reported on the 24th, that's yesterday, that Ukrainian forces continue deploying vehicles against Verbove, including Bradley IFVs. Geolocated combat footage posted yesterday shows a Ukrainian BMP operating within Verbove's westernmost village limits and getting struck by Russian forces while leaving Verbove. Now, this is called into question. This is interesting, this. I think Andrew Perpetua has this, and he's done it's really difficult to work out what the vehicle is because it's very blurry. But he said it's definitely not a BMP-1 and BMP-2, which is an old Soviet infantry fighting vehicle. Now, this is, I think, here. So you got Verbove here, and he's got it as a Russian BMD-4 destroyed. So he's saying it's not a BMP-1 or 2, it's more like a BMD. And if it's a BMD, that's a vehicle that the Russian airborne forces, which are operational in the area, use. And it's too fast for a BMP, and it's the wrong shape. So he said, I'm pretty sure that's a BMD. Now, it's really difficult to work out what it is. But if it's a Russian vehicle getting out of there, then that's interesting in itself. Where it's a Ukrainian vehicle, then that's interesting because the Ukrainian vehicles are driving out of Verbove. So I don't quite know what to make of these claims, but it's a vehicle, and some people say it's one, and some people say it's another. Anyway, George Barros here says it's a Ukrainian one. Many Russian sources are vehemently denying any Ukrainian breakthrough in Verbove as of yesterday. Some Russian sources are also reporting that Ukrainian forces are attacking north of Verbove and could isolate the 56th VDV regiment deployed in Novofedorivka from its sister regiments in the Verbove area. And this is what I was mentioning this morning, a similar thread. So this is the idea that there is an elite Russian unit based in Novofedorivka that might be isolated. Now, if there are all these rumors about them being isolated, and they seem to be coming from Russian sources, then that might suggest that the Ukrainians are this deep into Verbove. Because if they are that deep into Verbove, then they've actually got a chance of surrounding the Russians there. So if the Russians are, based in Novofedorivka, but also have troops, all around here in their VDV units and whatnot, and the Ukrainians are indeed halfway through into Verbove, so if they are kind of here, then you could imagine some kind of pincer movement that does end up encircling the Russians and their VDV unit in Novofedorivka. I think it's unlikely. I think that'd be too difficult. I think it'd be too easy for the Russians to get out of dodge. But, knowing how slowly the Ukrainians have moved previously, but if the momentum is picking up and if they really are halfway through the village, then actually, in a day or so, that's pretty good movement. You might see some attempt to do that. And if the Russians then try and get out of dodge, that kind of backwards movement, when they're not particularly good at doing an operational withdrawal, although they did a very good one in Kherson, but a slightly different context with different leaders, that kind of thing could end up becoming a rout, as morale is low, equipment is low, training is low for some of these troops, although these are VDV, but we know that the force quality is somewhat lower. So this could be, best case scenario, I suppose, is that there could be a really good outcome from this. Worst case scenario, I think, is going to be a grinding, incremental gain again for the Ukrainians. So, anyway, as I say, they might be cut off according to some Russian sources. Remember, these are Russian sources. Our team, so the RSW, does not assess that an encirclement of the 56th VDV is likely, though Ukrainian forces may isolate it from the rest of the 7th VDV division if Ukrainians manage to outmaneuver it from Verbove's north and the regiment inexplicably remains in its current positions. So, if weirdly the Russians decide to stay there and try and fight it out, then they're more likely to be cut off and things might end badly. Anyway, just finally, a Russian VDV source warned that there is a real threat of Ukrainian forces reaching the 59th VDV Regiment's rear near Novofedorivka on September the 21st. So that's some time ago they were warning that this could well be happening or might happen soon. The VDV source warned on the 22nd that Ukrainian forces are within 7 kilometers of encircling the 56th and that the regiment would be in a difficult position if its commander did not make a decision to withdraw from Novofedorivka to other previously prepared positions. So that is the kind of let's stay here and attack form of defense rather than pull back to pre-prepared defensive position. I mean, that's the point of those positions being constructed, right? Kenneth Gregg, the Finnish fighter in Ukraine, who's now doing sort of charity work, says the reporting from the Verbove front is a bit confusing. There are reports of a major breakthrough, or that we have been countered. Now, he quite often relies a lot on stuff that's in OSINT. He does have his sources as well, but take what he says with a pinch of salt. The truth is that we made a major attack with armor, which the Russians beat back, but with heavy losses. So the Russians took heavy losses, and we were kind of repelled. We also lost armored vehicles. This was an attack on the absolute strongest line of defense the Russians have in this area. Why they decided to attack there, I don't know, because we have had and are having success on the flanks. Anyway, the result is that this area is somewhat contaminated. That is, we have extended the active combat zone. Right now, we are regrouping the area for more tactically correct attack. At Novoprokopivka, we are successfully killing the Russian VDV troops. Our artillery is hitting the targets and our drones are doing a good job. However, we are increasing the pressure on the Russians by continuous attacks with small groups that actually have surprisingly low losses. At some stage in the near future, the crack on the Russians' lines will appear. So here's another person claiming that the ratio of losses of Ukrainians to Russians is much to the favor of the Ukrainians. Up at Klishchivka, especially north of the former village, the fighting is already going on the other side of the railway. In addition, we have gained a foothold on the first tree line, which does not bode well for the Russians. South of Novoherivka, local battles go back and forth, but in general, the lines are stable, despite the Russians throwing in new men to replace those that have already entered the meat grinder. On other fronts, the Russians have begun digging in even deeper than normal to survive the winter. As a result, the offensive raids have decreased significantly in intensity. Okay, so, and he finishes it there. So that is, I think, a good synopsis of what's going on. Russian sources reporting heavy fighting near Verbove, and losses on their side are reported to be high, with med evacuations being impossible to conduct due to heavy artillery shelling. So that's coming from Russian sources, reported by War Monitor there. And P-Star 11 says a Russian tank southwest of Verbove is damaged by a FPV drone. Notice that the tank moves freely as if no mines, approximately between the second and third Surovikin lines, according to the Ukrainian way of differentiating lines. Now, what's significant about this is you have a tank that is somewhere around here, I think, that is operating freely. It's a Russian tank, but the idea is if it's moving around without any care in the world type thing, then there aren't many mines there, right? If that was happening over here, that tank would have been blown up, right, at the beginning of the counteroffensive. This was absolutely massively mined. But as they've got further forward, and this is what many analysts have been saying, it will be less mined. And indeed, there's evidence that it's not so heavily mined just by looking at the Russian tank movements themselves. Okay, finally on this sector, while Western analysts complained about the slow pace of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, the relatives from the 70th Russian Regiment mostly are frantically looking for their men, who all disappeared near Robotyne or Verbove lately. The Russian command has never heard of them. So there are many posts like these on Russian social media. So just trying to put the pieces of jigsaw together, there are many families back in Russia worrying about their loved ones who appear to be in that sector and not being heard from, being lost. So there might well be heavy Russian losses in that area. Right, we're going to go now to, so just to say, in terms of the lines moving, there are some movements for deep state maps north of Novoprokopivka. There are claims that that the Ukrainians are fighting within the northern outskirts of that settlement. There are various claims as to the Ukrainians being in Verbove. Have no idea. We'll have to wait to see what the situation is. I'm sure it will all come out in the wash. We'll know eventually. It could well be that Ukrainians are well within Verbove, or it could be they're fighting on the outskirts like Novoprokopivka. Who knows? And then to finally Kherson, where we are seeing a lot of imagery like this. So Russia dropped aerial bombs on Berislav, Kherson region. This was reported by the head of the regional military administration. Now, I talked about this a lot recently, that the Russians are using aviation rather than counter battery or artillery fire, and that's probably because they don't have the artillery, but they do have the aviation. The aviation and the FAB 500 bombs are really effective. When you look at Andrew Perpetua's map and the amounts of pins he has here, it's absolutely incredible. So if you just look at the area he's talking about, so you've got Berislav up there, and then you've got other places down the river here, you can see how many aviation attacks there are. Russian airstrike, right? That's 24 hours, right? And then that's yesterday, 24 hours before that, and then 24 hours before that. So I'm going back days, right? And just look along this area. So all of these red pins are Russians doing something that is blowing up things on the other side of the river. Every single day, they are hammering away at the Ukrainians there. And that will have an effect. You know, those FAB 500s are pretty heavy explosive devices and are causing, I think, the Ukrainians probably quite a few headaches there, to say the least. That's a horribly big understatement there. Anyway, that's a really big analysis of what's going on. Not so much map work, but I think really interesting stuff from the ISW and other sources. And I get the sense that again, things are happening in Robotyne, and we are on the cusp of potentially some really big outcomes here. I don't know whether I'm being too positive due to my biases. Let me know what you think in the threads below. Thank you for listening to this long one. Take care. Speak soon.